Hello world, this is Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor. And in this Coding Bootcamp 101 free introduction about what you need to know before spending $10,000 or more, I've decided to make one more part before we dive in and do some hands-on exercises in each of the 5 main parts. The goal of this video is to provide a logical, affordable, and effective way to attack the 5 areas of the full stack. Now, as we discussed before, the full stack really consists of only 5 main parts. 3 are in the front end: HTML, hypertext markup language, CSS, cascading style sheets, and JavaScript. Those 3 front-end technologies are not going to change very soon. So in my opinion, you do not need to go to an expensive boot camp to get these 3 front-end technologies. There is a wide range of fantastic materials, textbooks, and free tutorials on each of these 3 topics. The key for you, in my opinion, is to find an excellent author for your materials. And when we do our hands-on exercises, I'm going to show you some examples of some good resources as well as some red flags to look out for, because there's a lot of old material on the internet or incorrect material on the internet on those 3 front-end technologies. On the back end, you're going to need to learn a server-side language, as well as something about databases in order to build a web app, the full stack. Now, sequencing the stack, I have a definite opinion on this. Because you're going to want to build a web page at some point in your computer science degree, because after all, that's how you share information with people, you're going to need to learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So given that those 3 languages are going to be part of every computer science major's life, and given they're 3 of the easiest to start with, I think it makes sense to start there. Hypertext markup language is a markup language. It marks up content. Style sheets style and lay out the content. And JavaScript, which is a full-blown programming language, but much different than Java, provides interaction when a user is clicking and scrolling through a web page. I highly recommend that you take those 3 languages in order. And typically, you can get that knowledge fairly inexpensively at your local community college. Now, your choices for the server side, the database, and the server side language are much more complicated, and we'll learn why in this screencast. Before I go any further, I want to say one more word about libraries and frameworks. In my previous screencast, I believe I called Bootstrap a JavaScript library or a JavaScript framework. Bootstrap does include JavaScript. So I would not recommend that you try to use Bootstrap before knowing something about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. jQuery, on the other hand, is a library of pure JavaScript. If you have been introduced to jQuery, it can do some powerful things on a web page. But if that's your introduction to JavaScript, I highly recommend you back up and learn pure JavaScript. Otherwise, you'll expect all JavaScript to work in the shortcut ways that jQuery works. And that is simply not true. So libraries and frameworks are fantastic tools, but don't start there. You will always be frustrated with the syntax. Start with a pure HTML, a pure CSS, and a pure JavaScript class. Let's talk about the full stack again. When we get to the server side, we're talking about the database and the server-side language that's the glue that pulls everything together. When we talk about the database, you're going to want to take a class or perhaps go to a boot camp that teaches you about the database side. And in my opinion, you need to learn about relational databases. Yes, there are other database models, but the relational database model is the tried and true brilliant structure that was developed way back in the 70s that still fuels the majority of applications today. Within the topic of database, there are 3 things you need to learn. Number 1 is theoretical. It's modeling, how to structure your data and your relationships. Some people call that normalizing the data. That's just a fancy word for how do we set up the tables and the fields and the relationships between the tables we need to create appropriate relational database model. There are different names for tables. There are different names for relationships. Don't let that throw you a curveball. It's very similar between a very small database and a very large database. Secondly, you'll learn that modeling and you'll implement that model through a relational database management system, a piece of software. that becomes the warehouse for the data. 3 common warehouses are MySQL, that's an open source software. It works well with PHP as a back-end server-side language, SQL Server, which is a Microsoft product, and Oracle, which scales small through medium through extremely large relational databases. And third, you'll want to learn SQL, Structured Query Language. It's slightly different between the different relational database management system software warehouses, but the basics between all relational database management systems are the same. So once you learn the basics of SQL, you can fairly easily apply those skills to another relational database management system. So when you learn your database skills, look for these 3 components: good theory and modeling on how to set up a relational database, a solid relational database management system such as MySQL, SQL Server, or Oracle that's used as the example, and a very solid grounding in structured query language. With those 3 components under your belt, you've got number 4 tackled. Let's further talk about the full stack. When you get to your server-side languages, when you're building a web app, you will probably also use a framework. And remember that a framework is simply a system, a software environment where there are a number of rules, and those rules may apply to variable names, they may apply to file names, they may apply to folder names, they may apply to software that you're using to develop the application. And so the word framework is a very wide term that can mean something different to almost everyone. But because building web apps is complicated and because there are so many files and so many pieces to the puzzle, these frameworks are enormously helpful tools to help us stay organized and help us build applications in a similar way from person to person, developer to developer, so that I could come into your application and read and understand it if we agree to use the same framework. And for PHP, here are some of the familiar frameworks that you might have heard of. Laravel, WordPress, which is commonly also called a CMS, content management system, Joomla, which is also a content management system. All 3 of those frameworks use PHP or are written in PHP. Because WordPress uses PHP, that's why we can say PHP is the number 1 server-side web app language, because so many web pages are powered through WordPress. But I cannot tell you how many students I've had that try to learn WordPress without going through the full stack as I've recommended. And they are frustrated because they cannot read the code that is produced by WordPress. If you learn the full stack and put PHP as your 5th item on your stack, you will love WordPress. One of the most popular frameworks for Node.js server-side JavaScript is Express.js. For C#, Microsoft's product, it's ASP.NET. You might have used Visual Studio and ASP.NET within Visual Studio. That's a framework to help you build web applications or any kind of application faster and more consistently. For Ruby, the most common framework is Rails. For Python, you might have heard of Django, and for Java, you might have heard of Spring MVC. Again, my high recommendation is do not worry about these frameworks. Learn the base language. And which language should you learn? Well, that really depends on your environment. I believe in my previous screencast, I mentioned that Java was a language of the past, and I didn't mean that it's not still extremely valuable. In my community, knowledge of Java would be very valuable. We are a Java town. But your town, your environment, your community, the company you might want to work for might be a Python shop, or it might be a Ruby shop, or it might be a Microsoft ASP.NET shop. It's also extremely popular in my community. So you'll want to pick the server-side language that's most valuable to you. It may or may not be what your community college is offering. It may or may not be what your computer science degree is offering. Now, do not worry if your computer science degree focuses on a language other than the one that I'm showing here. I'm showing 6 very popular, very valuable server-side languages, and But if you're at school and you're learning Haskell or you're learning C++ or C, do not worry. The employer is more interested in your ability to learn than specifically what you do know. And by getting that degree, you will have proven to him or her, your future employer, that you have a great capacity to learn. Now, if I were trying to learn the full stack the most inexpensive way possible, this is probably where I would look at a boot camp. I might look at a boot camp to just teach me the back-end database and the server-side language if I already knew a language. And I would probably look to my community college to teach me HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's if I did not need a degree. But if you have the money saved and if you have the ability to take the time to go get that computer science degree, I really don't see how that's ever going to hurt you. So this is number 5. Learn a server-side language. The framework will come later. The full stack, 5 big pieces. In my upcoming screencasts, I will be giving you short, small, hands-on exercises on each of these 5 pieces of the full stack. You can do it. It's fun and it's rewarding.